introduce us.
Perfect.
Welcome to our program today, Perspectives on Women's Issues with Alameda County District Attorney Nancy O'Malley. I am Laurel Plimier, and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Piedmont. And I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your afternoon to spend with us. Before we get to the introduction of our speaker and topic, I wanted to cover just a couple of logistics, as I always do. If you're on the Zoom call with us, please stay muted during the duration of the event. That will help us minimize background noise and prevent your video from accidentally popping up on the YouTube stream. You can post questions to our speaker now or anytime during the presentation, either using the Zoom chat, or if you're on YouTube, you can post them in the YouTube comments during the live stream. And if you're joining us on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel and click the bell to get notifications of future live stream events. And if you want advance notice of our events, you can go to our website, www.lwbpiedmont.org, to join our mailing list. And you don't have to limit yourself to the mailing list. You can also join the League. The League of Women Voters supports grassroots efforts locally and at the state and national levels in our efforts in voter education, advocacy, to influence public policy is extremely important work that we are doing now and for the foreseeable future. And with that, I will turn things over to Jennifer Trainer, who is one of our program committee chairs, and she will introduce today's program.
Thanks, Loretta. We are honored today to have Nancy O'Malley as our guest speaker. It's particularly meaningful because Nancy was scheduled to talk to us almost exactly a year ago to the day, and COVID hit, and we were going to be in person. That was our original plan, and have a lovely luncheon, and we had to pull back. And so thank you, Nancy, for joining us this year, a year later, and on Zoom. DA O'Malley is the Chief Law Enforcement Officer in Alameda County, a position she's held since being appointed to it in 2009 and then subsequently re-elected multiple times. She's the first woman to occupy this role, and she's known nationally and, of course, throughout California. DA O'Malley is a recognized expert worldwide on issues involving violence against women, human trafficking, and all forms of abuse against those who are most vulnerable in our society. She's pioneered many, many signature initiatives, and I'll just mention three of them. One is the Alameda County Family Justice Center. There's also the HEAT Watch program, HEAT standing for Human Exploitation and Trafficking, as well as a restitution program that ensures that those people who are convicted actually repay the victims who have suffered losses at their hands. She's helped draft legislation that has resulted in numerous bills on victims' rights being signed into law. DA O'Malley serves on multiple boards and has been honored with so many awards. They actually take up a full page, single-spaced, so I had to go through and just give a couple of examples. Such an impressive resume. Some of these examples are the Irvine Foundation Leadership Award. Another is the Fighter Against Wage Theft Award, the Visionary Voice Award from the National Sexual Violence Resources Center, and the State Leader Award from Leadership California. Today, she's going to speak to us about the most challenging women's issues she's faced during this time of COVID, as well as anything else that she feels is important for us to hear. Please join me in welcoming Nancy O'Malley.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. And I'm so honored to be with you again. I'm always very impressed with the Piedmont League of Women Voters. I know you have tremendous engagement and education and activism, and it's what we need so much of today. So today I'd like to share with you about the work that's being done to protect and empower women. And I'm going to add children to that also, because this has been a very significant issue in my professional life and for many years. So I'm proud of the work of my office. in the work that we've been doing and the innovation that we've brought to adopt the law to help those who have been impacted by crime to heal from their crime and to, more importantly, heal from the trauma of crime. In my office and at the Family Justice Center, we subscribe to the science of hope. And there's actually a science now about hope. The women and children at the Family Justice Center were part of the research that created the science of hope. And hope is not just, oh, I hope I win the lottery, or I hope things will be different tomorrow. But hope is actually a mindset, and it can be measured. And it's just like we're able to now measure the adverse childhood experiences in children, we can do the same measuring someone's hope scale. And what we know is that when people's hope rises, that when they have the ability to see themselves different than the worst moment of their life, that their lives will tend to flourish and they will move on to have a happy, healthy life. So hope is really woven into all of the work that we do, both in my office and what I do beyond my office. We will continue always to look ahead to see what else we can do. But I am proud to say that we are a leader across the state and across the country in the issues that we've created, or the issues we're addressing, and how we're working to protect the women, and especially violence against women, addressing that. And it's important to build strong and effective and impactful policies and programs, which we share with other communities that are working in this direction. But to kind of understand why and the way in which things are handled here in my office, I'll share a little bit about my background. In 1970, BAYWAR, the Bay Area Women Against Rape, formed the first rape crisis center in the country. They were in Berkeley, and it was made up all of volunteers, women who came together to protest the lack of response by law enforcement or the court systems in sexual assault crimes. At the time, there was a serial rapist they called Stinky. That person was never caught, but he held Berkeley hostage for quite some time. And it was that motivated these women to come together and form this program that now is replicated throughout all of America. I was in college at the time, and I became a volunteer at what I think was the second rape crisis center in California. It was in Contra Costa County. And during my time as a volunteer, there was a serial rapist, which we called the East Area Rapist. We all now know that person as the Golden State Killer. We knew when we called him the East Area Rapist that he was dangerous, but not how dangerous. We knew that he held our communities in terror, and never knowing when he would strike, not knowing who he was, crimes were never being solved. And I, as an advocate for women who are being sexually assaulted, felt really hopeless and helpless. We did not know enough on how to support people that had been assaulted in that way. Through DNA, some 50 years later, we've identified this man and brought him to justice. And at the time, as I said, I was a rape crisis counselor, but I was also there when he admitted all of his crimes and was sentenced. When it all came together through the state, through DNA, and mostly through testing sexual assault kits, forensic kits that were still in existence for the last 40 or 50 years, that what we discovered was that he had committed at least 13 murders, at least 50 rapes, and 120 burglaries across California from 1973 to 86. The DNA testing, the work that brought all of these kits back into the crime labs, was a piece of legislation that I authored and sponsored to mandate law enforcement to submit forensic evidence kits to be tested so that we could identify perpetrators who were not known to the victim and then bring those people to justice. But at the same time, I also saw back then how incredibly unjust the system was to women and women who were victims of interpersonal violence crimes, that the police didn't pay attention to it. They blamed victims. If it ever got to a prosecutor's office, the prosecutors would do almost like a cross-examination of the victims. And I knew at that point in time that if I ever was in a position that I was going to do what I could to change that paradigm. So when I decided to go to law school, I knew that that was my task, was to be able to work to improve the safety, the recovery, and the empowerment of women. So to date, I know we commented about legislation I've worked on. I actually have 51 bills that I've written that have become laws. Testing the rape kits, mandatory testing, so police don't keep them in their evidence rooms. The Sexual Assault Victims Bill of Rights, so victims can know what's going on with their cases. The rights of children and other people who have disabilities when they go into the courtroom. You heard about the human trafficking work, which we've done, which is I'm so proud of. And also the very important legislation, which came to us through an initiative in 2012, Proposition 35, and that defined and outlined human trafficking so that we would know and tell the truth about what was happening to our women and children in California. The work that I've done before, especially, was important with domestic violence, and the work we're doing now is equally important. So not only with domestic violence victims, with sexual assault victims, with victims of human trafficking, with all victims of all forms of interpersonal violence, which is primarily women. It's not solely women, and I'm always clear that there are men who are being victimized in these ways, but primarily we see women coming into our system. We really want people to be safe, and so an important component of the Family Justice Center, which I'll talk about in just a second, is that it is not a requirement for to receive services that somebody participate or engage with law enforcement. We want people to be safe, and people that are involved in violence in their home or in their relationships, we want them to be safe, but they may not be ready to leave. And some are not even equipped to leave because of the control factor in that relationship. Because domestic violence abuse is power over another, and it takes many forms. We know it's physical. We know that it's also mental and psychological. But what we've really learned a lot about in the last several years is the financial chokehold that abusers have over their victims, so that the victims are really almost paralyzed from being able to leave. We also know that in many of those families, that children that are witnessing violence will grow up and experience violence, or oftentimes will become batterers. So we work very hard with children to make sure that doesn't happen. But let me talk a little bit on to what we've been doing in the office. So we have a specialized unit that just deals with sexual assault cases. We have a specialized unit that deals with domestic violence cases, a stalking unit, a human trafficking unit. These are all important units because when we have the honor, really, and the responsibility of bringing cases into court, that we have to do so in a way that doesn't add further trauma to the person who was victimized in the first place. And all of this work has been done to create a system of justice that treats women fairly, respectfully, compassionately, and with the eye towards healing and empowerment. But I was very clear when I came to this office that was my main goal, was to change the paradigm, to support and help victims of crime, and to open up the eyes of others on what it was, on the trauma and the impact of these types of crimes. So Lowell Jensen, way back when he was district attorney here, he said that he was tired of victims being treated like pieces of evidence. And this office, I'm proud to say, was the very first prosecutor office in the entire country to give focus to victims of crime and to give support. So I have 40 people now who are professionals who are just working to support victims of crime as we go through the system. We also have, as you heard, the Alameda County Family Justice Center, which I opened in 2005. We were the second justice center in the country to open, and we've been awarded by the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Victims of Crime and the Office of Violence Against Women as a model for collaborative, comprehensive care. More than 15,000 people were coming through our doors, along with almost 2,000 children to access the services and the resources that we had for them. And because many of the households, women were the primary caregivers, that we also gave great focus to the impact of the crime, not only on the victim, the woman, but on her children as well. What impacts girls can oftentimes impact their destiny when we don't deal with trauma, when we don't deal with childhood adverse experiences, when we don't do anything to help people raise their hope as they heal from trauma. And what impacts boys and young men as children also can define who they are as adults. So we work very carefully and very closely at the Justice Center with the 35 other partner agencies that are on site. When I first started looking at the concept of a Justice Center, I did a survey and I realized a woman with children who was a victim of domestic violence would have to go to as many as 25 different locations to be able to access all of the needs that she had for herself and her children. And that was intolerable, number one, but also impossible, because we're dealing with people who are operating with extreme trauma. And to expect them to be able to navigate all of these various systems was unrealistic. And that's why the Justice Center came about. We brought everybody into one building so that a victim could come to one building and have all of the needs met, or most of the needs met that she needed. The Family Justice Center really started as a center of collaborative, comprehensive response, but we've grown so much because we've learned so much. So we provide tremendous resources to victims and to their children. We are a place of empowerment, especially with children, where we're teaching kids how to read, we're helping them with homework, and a lot of other programs. We have kids go to camp, away camp, so that they can just be kids and get away from the trauma and the stress of the life where there's violence. We also have service providers that provide civil, legal, family law, emergency relocation, counseling, and it's really expanded to be this place of empowerment, as I said, because it's not enough to help victims or women to move away from that particular violent environment, but it's as importantly to help them have the skills, develop the skills to be able to take care of themselves and their family, especially around financial literacy and job preparedness. So we have programs that have been teaching women to farm. We have programs that are teaching women to write code. And right now we have over 100 women who have gone through our program who now are code writers and making a living wage. We do a lot of seminars. And during COVID, and this is a place where we really had to try to think differently and pivot how we're going to continue this vital, vital service to people who are being hurt with COVID, with everything shut down. We were shut down for 3 days at the Justice Center, but we reopened and we do a lot of our work virtually. But one of the biggest messages that we had, and most important messages we had during COVID, was to let people know that there was help available. Because think about it, many women and children were housed and sheltered in place with somebody who was abusing them without an outlet or a way to get away from that, and without even being able to go to somebody else's house or to some place where you could get safety. So what we did was we made brochures and posters and flyers, and we put them in the food bank bags, and we worked with our grocers throughout the county and put up posters, just letting people know that help was available, that the Justice Center was open. We did public service announcements and ran them on Comcast and other places, and we did a lot of social media just to let people know that we were here to help them. And many of our partners continue to work remotely, but we've all gotten used to this remote way of doing business. And we found that while the clients the ones that have come in person has gone down, the number of people who are accessing our help has gone up. So right now we receive an average of about 550 calls a month from clients, and that's from all over the county and even outside of the county. Where we once had several hundred clients come into the center each month, we now only have about 70, but it is starting to increase every day. With last month, we saw 140, we doubled the number of people who came into the Justice Center. And at the same time, we had a camp for kids out in our parking lot where they were able to do arts and crafts and just have fun. And also always we build an educational component to it. But one of the biggest transformations that we made during COVID as a result of COVID is our housing. we started providing housing for women and children. One night I was driving home and I was down by where the Oakland Police Department is, and I saw a woman in front of me. She was driving in front of me and she pulled over, and I was at a stop sign so I could see her, and she got out of her car and took a blanket from the front seat and covered her two kids that were in the back seat. She got in the passenger with a blanket, and that's where they slept that night. And it was no surprise that it is no surprise that for women who are unhoused or in the homeless population, there are hundreds and maybe thousands of women with children. And the research tells us that across the United States, there are only 55,000 beds that are reserved for women who are victims of domestic violence or are unhoused or homeless. So in our own county, we have very few shelter beds and very few transitional housing beds for women with children, and especially during COVID, because if one person tested positive or was exposed, the shelter had to shut down. So we were scrambling to figure out what to do to keep the women with their children and women housed during this time. We also know that when a woman is homeless, she is at the highest risk for sexual assault, for human trafficking, and for domestic violence. And this is a population that we can and have the capacity to help. So I worked for months with the Board of Supervisors to purchase a hotel on Harrison. Some of you have probably driven by it many times like I had, but I never paid attention. It's a beautiful yellow hotel across from the cathedral. And on the outside of the building is inscribed, dedicated to the nobler womanhood in 1926. Well, we got pretty close to being able to buy that hotel. That would have been a hotel for women with children and women who had to leave their home because of violence. But when it fell through, we pivoted and we started providing emergency housing. So far, we've housed 400 women with children who have been fleeing human trafficking and domestic violence. And one case that really stands out for me involves a woman who was beaten by her abuser. He had broken her ribs. She was released from the hospital and was recovering in a tent near the Alameda Tube. We were able to give her emergency housing and connect her with other agencies. And today, she is now in her own house and her abuser is being prosecuted. So she is safe, as are her children. We've done a lot to build up the structure, and especially, as I said, financial literacy, but also for many women who are now on their own, teaching them skills, how to fix your own car, how to change a tire, how to change the electrical outlets and things like that. So we have classes for women really learning to be independent. And it's that independence that will allow them and their children to not ever be under the thumb of or the control of a violent abuser. And at the Family Justice Center, we expanded our Trauma Recovery Center. This is a standalone, licensed, certified trauma recovery center led by a psychologist. There are 4 therapists and an LCSW trainee. We have a partnership with Jewish Family Community Services, who will primarily provide mental health trauma and mental health services and trauma services for youth and children. And at the Trauma Recovery Center, we're now seeing over 100 people a month. These are all free services, and remote has allowed us, or virtual has allowed us, to continue to serve people who can't get to the Family Justice Center. But of course, there's now that we're opening back up and allowing more people in, that we'll see an increase, I'm sure, in access of those services that are trauma recovery, that are empowerment, and that are helping their children, all of whom have been physically out of school in the last year, to be ready to go back to school. Despite our public awareness campaigns, which we really enhanced over the last year, that victims of these frequently co-occurring crimes continue to encounter the harms and the barriers to justice and safety, meaning that far too often victims are still being blamed for crimes that are committed against them. Questions like, well, what did you do before he hit you? Or why were you out that late? Or how were you dressed? These are all victim blaming practices that we work very hard to eliminate and eradicate. But our work is not done because the criminal justice system really underestimates the strength and power of the empowerment of women. To shift this unusual balance and work more towards just and meaningful dispositions, prosecutors around the country have gained technical and legal and scientific proficiency, and that is necessary to evaluate cases for prosecution. We are at the forefront of that. We are leaders in letting other communities know by keeping statistics, by challenging our decisions, by really looking at outcomes. We're able to help other communities and other counties see where they may have deficits or they might have implemented some policies that were more destructive than empowering. So we teach a lot of prosecutors to understand the value of multidisciplinary collaborations, that the extra legal support for victims, and this research informed and data informed practices that are outside of what happens in the criminal court, whether it's a plea, a trial, or sentencing. And we train law enforcement also, because law enforcement for many is the first contact that a victim will have. And that contact can be very empowering or can be very destructive. We also know that racial bias does exist when prosecuting crimes of interpersonal violence, and it's particularly racial profiling shows more disparities, show more in the African American community when women report sexual assault or domestic violence. And so we work a lot with other communities to unveil their implicit bias in making judgments about when an African American woman is assaulted, or when a woman is sexually assaulted. For us, we remain vigilant and mindful that many cases will stop at the police level. So we work really closely with law enforcement to make sure that they are handling cases appropriately, to make sure that they are referring cases, they're bringing victims to a hospital for forensic exams, and that they're bringing the cases to our office so that we can review them for charges. And I will share with you that the year before COVID, we filed 275 sexual assault cases. We filed 271 human trafficking cases and 1,190 domestic violence cases. But since COVID, in that same 12-month period, post-COVID or since COVID hit, we have filed 196 sexual assault cases, 85 heat cases, and 1,195 domestic violence cases. And we really believe that all of the outreach that we've done with domestic violence and letting people know in sexual assault, that has empowered victims to report when something has happened to them. With the human trafficking cases, we're continue to be very concerned. Oakland and Alameda County has been a hotspot for many years since we started looking at this. And we do a lot of research. We're out on the streets. We are leaving messages, and where there's an activity that we take part in, not just us, but a lot of community members. And we build, we'll say, altars where there's flowers and beads and canned food and things like that. And we write on the sidewalk messaging to victims of human trafficking to let them know that we are there for them and there is help available. But we did we looked at one 24-hour period in October last year, 2020, during COVID. And we found 1,165 ads for selling sex in Oakland. And we could determine that represented 998 individual females. So 1,165 ads in one 24-hour period, 998 individual females, and estimated that more than 70% were minors or young adults. We call them transition age youth. And this is during COVID. So we remain very vigilant about our ability to outreach into the community regarding human trafficking. Our community education and community awareness is fantastic, but we still have far too many victims on the streets or on the internet who are being sold daily here in our community. The biggest challenge that we've had during COVID is that the courts we're just starting up jury trials again. The courts were closed for a bit. They have been closed down most of the courtrooms. So we have been very impacted by the lack of the ability to get into a courtroom. When people were seeking restraining orders, they had to do it virtually. And if you're a self-represented litigant, it's almost impossible to navigate that legal system. So our courts are now starting to open back up, but it's really hard to resolve cases when there isn't a courtroom to go into. And so right now, our challenge is we have 523 sexual assault cases that are waiting for a court date. 523. We've got 326 human trafficking cases, with 109 that are coming up for court soon. And we have over 1,000 domestic violence cases which are waiting to get into a courtroom to have resolution. We're being very thoughtful, and at the same time, we're being very realistic about our ability to get all of those cases into court. So we're working with victims, we're working with the defense attorneys, we're trying to come up with solutions that we can resolve these cases safely and fairly, and not wait years for a case to ever get into court. So you can see that we're spending a lot of time with the victims, keeping them informed and keeping them supported. And it isn't just what is your need right now, but we'll talk to you in a couple of weeks. You may have a different need, and we're going to help you to take care of that. With the human trafficking, we've received a very large grant that's 1 year only, but it has the ability to be continued for an additional 3 years. And we have 18 partners working with my office to improve the outcomes for minor victims of human trafficking. But sadly, there are still far too many programs. Let me pivot over and talk a little bit about what's happening with the funding that helps support victims of crime. The Victims of Crime Act, Voca, we call it, was enacted in 1984. And that fund this year is proposed to be cut by $600 million, which is catastrophic to the millions of survivors across this country who receive shelter or legal assistance, housing and counseling, and their other needs met. And this has started because the Department of Justice in the previous administration, under the previous Attorney General, stopped bringing cases to court. They started resolving cases short of bringing prosecution forward. And it was the money, the restitution from those cases that would go to fund the Victims of Crime Act. And now those monies are diminishing, but there's still plenty of money there. So a lot of us around the country are advocating, calling our senators saying, please don't cut the Voca funds. Those are vital to the existence of so many people across this country. The Violence Against Women Act was enacted in 1994 when President Biden was then Senator Biden, and he really brought that bill forward and that law forward. And right now it's up for reauthorization, called the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2021. The last Congress passed a bipartisan reauthorization, but the Senate refused to take it up. In fact, it's been 8 years since the last reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. So President Biden is now urging Congress to come together in a bipartisan manner to ensure a swift passage in both the House and the Senate. And now the new VAWA, the new Violence Against Women Act, will include significant improvements and increased pathways to safety that were proposed by advocates and survivors, lawyers, experts, prosecutors, and law enforcement. We're all in the trenches, and we're all working with victims and survivors to protect and support them. And so this new Reauthorization Act will have great improvements and enlightenment as long as we can get it passed. Every single Senate Democrat signed on to the Senate version of the House, that the House passed bill. But the Republican Senate leadership refused to bring VAWA to the floor also. So as President Biden says, this should not be a Democrat or Republican issue. It's a matter of justice and compassion. Now, some of these programs that are bringing resources and respect and life back to victims of crime are really critical to our ability to help people heal, to help people move beyond and to help people raise their children in a safe, healthy, empowering environment. But unfortunately, that so much of these bills that are vital are falling into a system that looks more like a political chess match. And it's not like the old days, I'm sorry to say. It's not the usual give and take. I'll give you this on your bill if you give me that on my bill. And that's how it used to be done. The legislators could step across the aisle and come together on important bills that helped America, that helped people like victims of crime, or to help curb violence against women. But now the political disintegration is now plaguing our Congress. And this is very unfortunate, which is why it's so important for people like you and me to use our voices to really demand that our Congress act on some of these critically important bills that are coming forward and trying to get them to President Biden. Social media for sure has fueled the flames of all of this distrust and disintegration of our political process. Facebook, Reddit, Twitter, they're all sites that have ferocious political exchanges that can, and in many respects, are polarizing our country. A dispute is no longer a dispute, now it's a crisis. And there is no explaining that can go on when we're working through social media. When somebody puts a post up, even if it's completely wrong and not true, and we've experienced that, there's almost no way through social media to bring the facts, to bring the truth to bear. There's no education attached to accusations that are being thrown back and forth. And the unrest that exists in our country today is incredibly disturbing and very upsetting, I'm sure, to you as much as it is to me. But you know, like I said, when we rely on social media, or so many people in our country rely on social media for their information and their news, there's really no ability to explain the true facts. And that adds more to the tension and the dispel of unity in our country. So the days of reaching across the aisle appear to be gone. I hope not, but I'm hopeful. But even when we were trying to address the coronavirus issue and what could be done or what should be done, that became political warfare. So putting politics aside and thinking back in terms of how women have advanced in this country and how women have really taken their seat at the table. My favorite saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Women have found their seats at the table. But this discord that exists in America, this fighting that's going on in America, and especially in our American politics, is very disturbing and destructive. So putting politics aside, just look what's happening with the Congresswoman Liz Cheney. She's the only woman Republican in leadership. And she's a woman who spoke her truth. She was criticized for it. But now the efforts are to oust her because she spoke up. And this feels to me like the old days when women spoke up and our voices were suppressed and repressed. She spoke up, and now her leadership is being in jeopardy. And she's the only woman who's in Republican leadership. So I reflect on this quite a bit because I want our country to work, and I want people to be served, and I want us to have unity. I believe in what the president said in his inauguration address, like, let's come together. Now is the time. But we can, and I hope we do, work to bring civility back into our political process, because America will be better for that. And we can debate and we can disagree and we can argue respectfully, but we really cannot allow the lies, the political accusations, the polarization become the norm. That we have to, I hope that we will all band together and put a stop to that and say no more. We will not accept this from our elected leaders or from our community. Because the good people and the general public were really tired of the fighting. At least I am, and I'm guessing you are too, because you care about the political environment. You care about right and wrong, and you care about the truth, just like I do. And it's been pointed out by President Joe Biden, listen and hear one another. That's what he said. Let's listen and actually hear one another, show respect for one another, and reject the culture in which facts themselves are manipulated and even manufactured. If we want unity, we need to get back to the facts. So I will continue to work in my small way to bring respect and civility, unity and truth back to our great country. And I will never stop working to enhance the rights of and the protections for and the empowerment of women and their children who fall victims of crime or are suffering from discrimination, from racial disparity, from any other form that holds them down from being as beautiful and as full a life that they're entitled to. So with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We do have a bunch of questions, and I'd like to get to at least some of them. I'll start. I'm just going to read this one because it's well written. Several clerical abusers of women have been charged by your office, but have fled overseas. For example, a former pastor at St. Joseph's in Alameda. Their pastor was charged about 1 year ago with both civil and criminal charges. The pastor is reportedly back in India, his home country, with no intention of returning to face charges. How can the DA's office help bring closure to those who claimed he harassed them? And there are several clergy in Alameda County that have also been charged with harassment and disappeared. So that particular case is not unique. Can you talk about that?
That's right. The case is not unique. So, you know, what is challenging about the particular case that is referenced is that that individual had his passport taken away, and somehow he managed to leave the country. So I would say that the criminal justice system is one part of the healing process, but we are quite equipped and do a lot of work with victims of cases where they've never identified the perpetrator or solved the crime. And so we have a lot of resources. We have a lot of work that we do with those that are survivors of priest and molest and other crimes like that. And we continue supporting victims even well beyond when the case is resolved in one way or another. And I just urge anyone out there, as we do when we go out and speak to different parishes, is that first that if the people can speak up, to really encourage them to speak up. But secondly, that there are resources, there are ways, there are good therapeutic models, there are good, they're really effective trauma recovery models that we employ, not just us, but those that we fund to work with survivors of priest molest, and that have proven to be very, very effective for many, many people.
You mentioned putting flyers and posters out to let people know about your services, and you just mentioned going to parishes. Are there other things that you do to get the word out to those who are in need of services? And is there anything that we can do to help on that front?
Well, yes, there's plenty for all of us to do, which is, first of all, you know, you know about the resources that we have. We do town hall meetings. We go to different community meetings. We're doing it virtually now. We've done Facebook Live with families. We are talking with families at the schools. I mean, this year's been a little bit more challenging because the schools haven't been in session, but we've done a lot to get the word out. About 25%, we're here in Oakland, the Justice Center is, but the county, obviously we have offices throughout the county, and we do a lot of community events. Just last week, we were in Union City, we've been in Fremont, we've been in Hayward, we've been in Oakland at different events. So wherever we have the opportunity to share and bring materials for people. And some people don't even recognize their own victimization until they start reading a brochure. Our brochures are in multiple languages, I think 9 languages. And our website is also in multiple languages. So, we rely on our community partners also to get the word out, just like we would really appreciate all of you being able to share if you know of something or when you hear of something.
You mentioned the large numbers of online women being trafficked post-COVID. And do you have an idea for that high number? Is it that women are struggling with finding employment, and this is the only way they can get money, or is there some other factor at play?
That's an excellent question. So a lot of what we see are minors, 15, 16, 17. We've had cases where the victim has been as young as 12 years old. In fact, my very first case in 1997 involved a 12-year-old girl who lived around the lake with her mom and her sisters, and she was being trafficked, and nobody knew what to do. And I prosecuted the trafficker and the 50-year-old man that had purchased her. And we didn't even have a crime then called trafficking. We didn't get that until several years later. So for some women that are involved in the commercial sex world and the sex workers, for some that we talk to, and we support a lot of women, we tend not to prosecute. We have women that come into a program that has been very effective, sort of this big group program. And many of the women have shared with us that they were abused as children, or they were sold as children or exchanged for drugs as children, and then trafficked. And so they did not know anything else they could do. And that awakening and that awareness has helped many to move away from the sex trade. There are some that choose that trade, for sure. But what we see are the traffickers, where this is really a crime of violence. It is these people, we mostly see women, but we know that men and boys are being trafficked also. They just present differently in our system. But what we have seen is the internet has exploded, and probably because of COVID, because there wasn't that much foot traffic on the street. So if somebody's out there, you can't blend. A lot of our neighborhoods, some of our neighborhoods are really being infiltrated with trafficked individuals. And we know that because they tell us. They may not be able to feel like they can get away from a trafficker, but they tell us, and by us, I mean the community that comes out to support and make sure that we're giving messages. But we have an awful lot of young people who have had no place to go, and they get picked up by a trafficker, and they get lured into this false relationship, and then they're put on the street. And if they try to leave, violence is attached. We've had girls be killed. We've got, as you saw, we've got over 300 cases pending right now. We have prosecuted in this county more than 800 human trafficking cases involving minors. That's 800. That's more than the rest of the state combined. And actually, the Department of Justice will say it's probably more than the entire Department of Justice. But we've been very active in prosecuting cases, and we have so many survivors that are thriving and are now coming back to advocate and are very important voices in the anti-trafficking movement.
Is that disparity in numbers between Oakland and other communities, is that because of the work that you're doing to prosecute, or is it because there is more traffic in Oakland and somehow Oakland has become a center for human trafficking, or both?
Well, and I'll say Alameda County, Oakland is a hot spot still. I don't think that we have more cases. I mean, I think people are coming here because they know that Oakland they're brought here because Oakland has, that this is where it's happening. But there's no community that is immune. Danville had one of the biggest adult human trafficking cases that went on for 20 years. And, we've had trafficking cases. One of our bigger ones was out in Livermore. So I'm constantly reminding everybody that trafficking is happening everywhere. Every state in our country has now have reports of human trafficking. If we don't look, we won't see. We look, and we've been looking for a long time. And we won't just sit back and say there's no solution. We are constantly looking for solutions and bringing survivors back to help us help those to separate away from a trafficker.
Is the Family Justice Center limited to Alameda County, and has it been used as a template for other communities, either locally or nationally?
So it's not limited to Alameda County. We do have people that come from Richmond and other parts of the Bay Area. We are a model for, now there are, I think, 175 family justice centers, and we're the model, one of the models for them. And we've had people come from China, from Israel, from France, from all over the world and all over our country to see how we're doing and what we're doing. For some family justice centers, they are only focusing on they started focusing just on domestic violence. But we knew going into it, and particularly for me with my background of sexual assault and human trafficking and domestic violence, that we wanted to be able to provide services to all victims of interpersonal violence. So we are the model for, one of the models for the country.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between cases of sexual assault or rape with strangers versus acquaintances or family members, and what differences you see in the center and what percentages fall in those categories?
Well, there are more sexual assault crimes committed by someone that the victim survivor knows. That's statistically right. It's probably 80% of the sexual assault crimes are committed by someone known to the victim survivor. With a stranger, it is now with the development of DNA, and because of the legislation that I did that requires law enforcement to get that forensic kit and get it into a crime lab within 20 days. They have to be tested within 20 days. There were 300,000 across America never touched, including in our county, which I was shocked about, but it was, and that's why we needed to mandate it. So we were able to identify perpetrators through DNA now, and there's a big database that the Department of Justice keeps, and there's a separate database that has known DNA, meaning we know who the DNA belongs to, and the other database is unknown. We don't know who it belongs to. And those get run against each other, and that's how we get hits. I think people probably saw just recently, we were able to charge the case of the kidnapping and murder of Michaela Garrett that happened 35 years ago or so in Hayward through a DNA hit, because the person who did the crime finally ended up in the system. And so DNA has helped us a lot with stranger rapes, and it's very hard to dispute DNA. And with family, when it's somebody not family or maybe, but someone known to the victim, we work the kind of intervention and therapy and trauma recovery that we do with that person can be a little bit different. I mean, for sure, the trauma of being sexually abused or sexually assaulted is the same no matter what. But when it's a family member, a trusted person, then there are multiple layers of trauma that exist. And we are very proficient and have been very aggressive at learning those trauma modules or modes of therapy to help people.
We have time for probably one or two more questions. So you talked about working to shift away from victim blaming with police and attorneys. Is that work that you facilitate, or is that conducted by some third-party trainers?
I facilitate a lot of it. I'm on I work with a national board. I'm on the board, and we do seminars all over the country. Now they're virtual, but we work with prosecutor offices. We work with the Department of Justice, who funds a lot of programs, and then they'll send us in as advisors or to look at how things are going and just do a lot of training. And so in both human trafficking and in sexual assault, and to an extent domestic violence, that we're constantly doing programs, writing, putting out periodicals and things like that.
You talked in the very beginning about developing a measurement for hope. Can you speak about that in a little more detail? Where did that concept come from? How do you actually measure hope? Is this something you implement in the center with the psychiatric personnel? Give us a little more details.
Sure. So the concept started with a professor from Oklahoma and the founder of the Family Justice Center movement, a guy named Casey Gwynn. And they really wanted, we all became very educated about ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, and how that could be measured and the kind of trauma or therapy we could employ. So we started looking at, for people that they would go through trauma treatment, but didn't seem to, their life didn't seem to move. They were still sort of stuck. And so that's where the research came. And we did a lot of research with, as I said, with the children at our Camp Hope, which is a camp up north. It's a therapeutic camp, but you wouldn't know it because it's not that way. It's just for kids to have fun. And then working with a lot of women in our Justice Center, asking them questions about at the beginning and then following through with different modalities and different involvement. So a lot of and it doesn't require, it can be helped by therapy, but it's not required therapy. It's, we will have our clients take a hope test when they first start working with us, if they want, of course. And then as we provide services and we, engage them and they see that their life can be different. And I think that's really the key, is that giving people the idea that their life doesn't have to be the way it is at the worst moment of their life. And so, empowering women going through our programs, even learning how to change the electrical outlet in your house safely is very empowering. And so as we empower and as we give more skill building and as we broaden the idea that I can do this, that then we measure hope at different levels. And you can really see the hope scale grow. So one of the seminars we had just before COVID shut down, it was put on by a group of the survivors at the Justice Center called From Homeless to Home Owner. And this was, to me, it gives me chills even when I think about it. To me, this was the epitome of hope, that these women came in hopeless, without any resources, without any idea how they could change. And here they are sitting in a seminar, 50 came, sitting in a seminar, learning how to deal with their credit, learning how to, do whatever you needed to do to eventually become a homeowner. That is hope.
I love it. As we wrap up, can you give us what is the most important thing that our members can do?
Right now, the most important thing is to not only reach out to our own members of Congress, either our representatives or ours are already on board with the funding for VAWA and Voca, but we can reach out to other states or to other partnerships in other states. So I hope that the League will really rise up and say, stop the bickering, stop the fighting, let's figure out what is good for America. And I think that, and also particularly with these dramatic cuts that they're proposing for these really vital programs that have changed the paradigm for hundreds of thousands of millions of women and men and kids, that we just be strong advocates with those that have the power to vote one way or the other. That I think is the most immediate need, is put the pressure on the people and let them know that we're watching.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
District Attorney Nancy O'Malley, who has been talking about perspectives on women's issues. So we are going to stay in this room for our annual meeting. If you are not going to be joining us for our annual meeting, you can leave the meeting